The bustling courtroom was a familiar setting for Judge Sarah Emerson, who had presided over countless cases during her distinguished career on the bench. As she surveyed the room, her keen eyes took in the usual scene. Defendants fidgeting nervously, lawyers conferring in hushed tones, and court officers maintaining order with a practiced authority. On this particular morning, the docket was filled with routine misdemeanors, petty theft, disorderly conduct, minor traffic violations. It was the kind of caseload that Judge Emerson could navigate with the efficiency of a seasoned professional, dispensing justice in a fair and impartial manner. As the next defendant was called, Emerson steeled herself for the familiar back and forth. A young black woman, no more than 25 years old, approached the defendant's table, clutching a worn purse to her chest. Emerson recognized the name, Alicia Jackson, but the face was unfamiliar. She gave a subtle nod to the court clerk, signaling that she was ready to proceed. The prosecutor, a seasoned litigator with a measured demeanor, rose to present the state's case. Your Honor, the defendant, Alicia Jackson, is charged with petty theft. On the evening of May 12th, Ms. Jackson was observed by store security exiting a local supermarket without paying for several items in her possession. Emerson listened intently, her expression betraying no hint of emotion. The prosecutor's account was straightforward, outlining the basic facts of the alleged crime. Alicia, her eyes downcast, remained silent, allowing her court-appointed attorney to handle the defense. The defense lawyer, a young man fresh out of law school, stood and cleared his throat nervously. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that she did not pay for the items in question. However, we would argue that this was an honest mistake, born out of the difficult circumstances Ms. Jackson is currently facing. Emerson's brow furrowed slightly as the lawyer continued. Ms. Jackson is a single mother, struggling to make ends meet. She works long hours at a minimum wage job, often leaving her young children in the care of relatives while she provides for her family. On the night in question, she was distracted, preoccupied with thoughts of how she would afford her rent and put food on the table. The oversight of not paying for those items was unintentional, Your Honor. The prosecutor countered swiftly, arguing that ignorance of the law was no excuse and that the defendant should be held accountable for her actions. Emerson listened impassively, her gaze shifting between the two attorneys as they presented their respective cases. After the final arguments had been made, Emerson leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers as she contemplated the evidence before her. It was a straightforward case, the kind she had presided over countless times. The law was clear, and precedent dictated a range of appropriate penalties for such an offense. Yet, as Emerson's eyes drifted to the young woman standing before her, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of empathy. Alicia's posture was that of someone burdened by the weight of the world, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. Emerson knew all too well the harsh realities faced by those living on the economic margins of society. With a deep breath, Emerson reached for her gavel, preparing to deliver her verdict. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the judge as she prepared to render her decision. The courtroom was hushed with anticipation as Judge Emerson cleared her throat and began to speak. In the matter of the state versus Alicia Jackson, having carefully considered the evidence presented, I find the defendant guilty of petty theft. Alicia Jackson tensed, her fingers gripping the edge of the defendant's table as the judge's words hung in the air. She had braced herself for this outcome, yet the finality of the pronouncement still stung. However, Emerson continued, her gaze leveling with Alicia's. Given the unique circumstances of this case, I am compelled to depart from the standard sentencing guidelines. The prosecutor, caught off guard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Departures from precedent were rare, especially for such a straightforward offense. Emerson's next words only heightened the growing sense of unease in the courtroom. Ms. Jackson, I am imposing a fine of $2,500 for your crime. Emerson paused, allowing the staggering figure to sink in. This penalty reflects the seriousness of your actions, as well as the need to deter similar offenses in the future. Alicia's eyes widened in shock, and she instinctively shook her head in disbelief. A $2,500 fine was an astronomical sum, far exceeding the typical punishment for petty theft. The young woman's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The defense attorney, equally stunned, quickly jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, a fine of that magnitude would be financially devastating for my client. Ms. Jackson is a single mother living paycheck to paycheck. She simply does not have the means to pay such an exorbitant penalty." Emerson raised a hand, silencing the lawyer's protest. "I am well aware of Ms. Jackson's financial circumstances, Counselor. However, the law is clear, and I have an obligation to uphold it. The fine I have imposed is within the court's discretion, and I believe it is warranted in this case." The prosecutor, sensing an opportunity, interjected. "Your Honor, the state would be amenable to a payment plan or community service in lieu of the full fine, if that would assist the defendant." Emerson considered the proposal for a moment before shaking her head. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Prosecutor. Ms. Jackson will be required to pay the full $2,500 fine within the next 30 days. Alicia's knees buckled, and she clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. Tears welled in her eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. A $2,500 fine was more than she earned in a month. It was a sum that would consume her entire savings and leave her family destitute. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the other defendants and spectators clearly taken aback by the severity of Emerson's ruling. The judge's gavel pounded sharply, restoring order. "This court is adjourned," Emerson announced, her voice unwavering. As she rose and exited the courtroom, Alicia Jackson remained rooted to the spot, her world crashing down around her. Outside the courthouse, the news of the controversial fine spread like wildfire. Civil rights activists and community leaders denounced Emerson's decision, accusing the white judge of unfairly targeting a black defendant struggling with poverty. The case was quickly thrust into the public spotlight, setting the stage for a heated debate over systemic inequities in the criminal justice system. The outcry over Judge Emerson's harsh fine on Alicia Jackson reverberated far beyond the walls of the local courthouse. Within hours, the story had gone viral, sparking outrage on social media and drawing the attention of prominent civil rights organizations. Reverend Michael Owens, a respected community leader and vocal advocate for racial justice, was among the first to condemn the judge's actions. Addressing a crowd of supporters outside the courthouse, he decried the ruling as a blatant example of the racial bias that permeates our criminal justice system. "How can we expect marginalized communities to trust the courts when judges like Sarah Emerson hand down such disproportionate and devastating penalties?" Owens demanded, his voice rising with passion. "This is not justice. It is oppression, plain and simple." The Reverend's words quickly gained traction, inspiring others to come forward with their own experiences of perceived bias in Emerson's courtroom. Soon, a pattern began to emerge, with Black and Hispanic defendants alleging that the judge had consistently handed down harsher sentences for similar crimes compared to their white counterparts. One such case involved a young Latino man named Carlos Mendez, who had been convicted of petty theft 5 years earlier. While Alicia Jackson faced a $2,500 fine for her offense, Mendez had been sentenced to 30 days in jail for a virtually identical crime. "It's always been this way," Mendez told reporters, his brow furrowed with frustration. "If your skin is darker, you can expect to be treated more harshly in Judge Emerson's courtroom. It's as simple as that." The growing chorus of complaints prompted the local chapter of the ACLU to launch a formal investigation into Emerson's judicial record. Poring over years of court transcripts and sentencing data, the Civil Liberties Organization uncovered what they deemed a disturbing pattern of racial disparities in the judge's rulings. "The numbers don't lie," declared ACLU attorney Samanthang. "Our analysis shows that Black and Hispanic defendants are significantly more likely to receive harsher sentences from Judge Emerson, even when the underlying crimes are comparable. This is a clear violation of the principles of equal justice under the law." He and her team presented their findings to the state's Commission on Judicial Conduct, demanding a thorough investigation into Emerson's conduct and potential disciplinary action. The public outcry only intensified as more details of the Alicia Jackson case came to light. Activists organized rallies and demonstrations, calling on the judge to reconsider the harsh fine. Prominent local politicians and community leaders joined the chorus of voices demanding accountability. In the midst of the growing controversy, Judge Emerson remained steadfast, refusing to comment publicly on the allegations or the ongoing investigation. However, behind closed doors, the respected jurist was grappling with a profound sense of unease. Emerson had always prided herself on her impartiality and commitment to upholding the law. The notion that her rulings could be tainted by racial bias was a troubling and deeply unsettling prospect. As the scrutiny intensified, the judge found herself questioning her own decisions, wondering if she had unwittingly allowed her own implicit prejudices to influence her judgments. With the future of her judicial career now hanging in the balance, Emerson knew that she would soon be forced to confront these painful questions head-on. The stakes had never been higher, both for her own legacy and for the pursuit of true justice in her community. In the midst of the growing public uproar over her controversial fine on Alicia Jackson, Judge Sarah Emerson found herself uncharacteristically flustered. The allegations of racial bias had struck a deep chord, casting a dark cloud over her decades-long judicial career. Emerson had always prided herself on her commitment to fairness and impartiality, traits that had earned her the respect of both prosecutors and defense attorneys over the years. The notion that her rulings could be tainted by unconscious prejudices was a troubling prospect that she struggled to come to terms with. It was against this backdrop that Emerson agreed to a rare one-on-one interview, determined to share her side of the story and defend the integrity of her decisions. Sitting across from the seasoned journalist, Emerson's usually steely demeanor betrayed a hint of vulnerability. "Look, I understand the concerns that have been raised, and I take them very seriously," she began, her brow furrowed with concern. "But I can say with absolute certainty that race played no role in my decision to impose that fine on Ms. Jackson." The journalist nodded, jotting down notes as Emerson continued. "The law is clear on the sentencing guidelines for petty theft. In most cases, a fine of a few $100s would be the standard penalty. But given the specific circumstances of this particular case, I felt compelled to depart from the norm." Emerson paused, her gaze drifting towards the windowsill where a framed photograph of her family stood. "Ms. Jackson is a single mother, struggling to make ends meet. I recognize the significant hardship that such a large fine would impose on her and her family. Believe me, it wasn't an easy decision." The judge's voice wavered slightly, betraying a rare glimpse of emotion. "My role is to uphold the law and ensure that justice is served. But I also have a duty to consider the broader context and the potential consequences of my rulings. In this case, I felt that a harsher penalty was warranted, regardless of the defendant's race or socioeconomic status." The journalist regarded Emerson with a thoughtful expression. "Yet the data appears to show a consistent pattern of harsher sentences for minority defendants in your courtroom. How do you respond to those allegations?" Emerson's jaw tightened, a flash of frustration crossing her features. "I'm well aware of the statistics that have been presented, and I understand why they are concerning. But the reality is that the data alone does not tell the full story." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Every case that comes before me is unique, with its own set of complex circumstances and mitigating factors. To simply compare sentencing outcomes without considering those nuances is an oversimplification." Emerson paused, her gaze hardening. "I have devoted my career to upholding the law and ensuring that justice is served, regardless of a person's race, ethnicity, or economic status. The suggestion that I would allow my personal biases to influence my rulings is deeply offensive to me." The journalist nodded, sensing the judge's discomfort. "So what do you say to those who argue that the system itself is inherently biased, and that judges like yourself are perpetuating those inequities, whether consciously or not?" Emerson's expression softened, a hint of wariness creeping into her voice. "I don't have all the answers, and I certainly don't claim to be perfect. But I can assure you that I am committed to constantly examining my own decision-making process, to rooting out any potential blind spots or biases that may exist." She leaned back in her chair, a resolute determination filling her gaze. The pursuit of true justice is an ongoing battle, one that requires vigilance, self-reflection, and a willingness to make difficult decisions. I may not always get it right, but I can promise you that I will always strive to uphold the principles of fairness and equality to the best of my ability. In the aftermath of Judge Emerson's controversial ruling, Alicia Jackson found herself thrust into the spotlight against her will. The young mother, still reeling from the devastating fine, had initially been too intimidated and overwhelmed to challenge the judge's decision. But as the public outcry grew, and Alicia's story became a rallying cry for civil rights activists, she began to find the courage to speak out. Encouraged by the outpouring of support from her community, Alicia decided that it was time for her voice to be heard. It started with a simple Facebook post, where Alicia shared her story in raw, emotional terms. "I'm a single mom, just trying to make ends meet and provide for my kids," she wrote. "That $2,500 fine is more money than I make in a month. I don't know how I'm going to pay it, or what will happen to my family if I can't." The post quickly went viral, with thousands of shares and comments expressing outrage and sympathy. Alicia's vulnerabilities, laid bare for all to see, struck a chord with those who had long felt marginalized by a justice system that often seemed stacked against them. Emboldened by the response, Alicia began to seek out media opportunities, sharing her story with local news outlets and community radio programs. In each interview, her voice grew stronger, her resolve more unwavering. "I know I made a mistake, and I take responsibility for that," Alicia declared in one particularly impassioned appearance. "But a $2,500 fine? That's not justice, that's cruelty. How can they expect a struggling single mom like me to come up with that kind of money?" Alicia's emotional testimony resonated widely, sparking a groundswell of support from both within her community and across the country. Activists and civil rights organizations rallied to her cause, offering legal assistance and organizing fundraising efforts to help cover the crippling fine. Alicia's story is a powerful example of the systemic inequities that plague our criminal justice system, said Reverend Michael Owens, who had been at the forefront of the protests against Judge Emerson. Her willingness to speak out and share her truth is an inspiration, and it's shining a much-needed light on the harsh realities faced by marginalized communities. As Alicia's profile continued to rise, she found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was grateful for the outpouring of support and the opportunity to amplify her voice. But the intense media scrutiny and the burden of her newfound role as a symbol of the fight for racial justice weighed heavily on her. "I never asked for any of this," Alicia confided to a close friend. "I just want to take care of my family and move on with my life. But now, it's like the whole world is watching, and I can't escape it." Still, Alicia knew that there was no turning back. Her story had become a catalyst for change, a rallying cry for those who had long suffered under the weight of an unjust system. With a deep breath, she steeled herself for the challenges that lay ahead, determined to use her voice to make a difference. As the investigation into Judge Emerson's conduct gathered momentum, Alicia Jackson stood at the center of the storm, her face etched with a mix of fear, resilience, and an unwavering resolve to seek the justice that had so long eluded her. The growing public outcry over Judge Sarah Emerson's controversial ruling against Alicia Jackson had become impossible for the state's Commission on Judicial Conduct to ignore. Faced with mounting pressure from civil rights advocates and community leaders, the Commission launched a formal investigation into the judge's conduct and potential patterns of racial bias in her rulings. The inquiry was led by a team of seasoned legal experts tasked with meticulously examining Emerson's judicial record over the past decade. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and a parade of witnesses from the community were summoned to testify. providing a comprehensive and often sobering account of the judge's decision-making process. Alicia Jackson herself took the stand, her eyes brimming with a mix of fear and determination as she recounted the devastating impact of the $2,500 fine. "That money was supposed to go towards rent, groceries, and clothes for my kids," she told the commission, her voice trembling. "Instead, I'm being forced to choose between keeping a roof over our heads or putting food on the table." The young mother's emotional testimony struck a chord with the commission members, who listened intently as she described the harsh realities of her daily struggle to survive. Alicia's story was just one of many that painted a disturbing picture of the human toll exacted by Emerson's rulings. Next, the prosecutors and defense attorneys took the floor, offering starkly contrasting perspectives on the judge's conduct. The state's representatives argued that Emerson's decisions were sound, grounded in the letter of the law and justified by the circumstances of each case. "Judge Emerson is a model of judicial integrity," asserted the lead prosecutor. "She is meticulous in her application of the law and impartial in her treatment of all defendants, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status." However, the defense attorneys painted a very different portrait, alleging a consistent pattern of harsher sentences for minority defendants. They presented reams of data, meticulously cataloging the sentencing disparities that had emerged from Emerson's courtroom. "The numbers don't lie," declared one defense lawyer, his voice rising with passion. "Time and time again, we've seen Judge Emerson impose longer jail terms, higher fines, and more onerous probation conditions on Black and Hispanic defendants, even when the underlying crimes were virtually identical to those committed by white offenders." The commission members listened intently, their brows furrowed with concern as they sifted through the evidence. It was clear that the heart of the matter rested not on the technical application of the law, but on the thorny and deeply complex issue of implicit bias. As the investigation continued, a parade of community members took the stand, sharing their own personal experiences and observations of Emerson's courtroom demeanor. Many testified to a palpable shift in the judge's tone and demeanor when presiding over cases involving defendants of color. "There's just a different energy in the room when it's a person of color standing before her," recounted one witness, a local small business owner. "You can feel the weight of her expectations, the assumption of guilt. It's subtle, but it's there." By the time the final witness had been heard, the commission members found themselves grappling with a profoundly troubling question. Had one of the state's most respected jurists allowed her own unconscious prejudices to taint the scales of justice? As the investigation drew to a close, an air of tension and uncertainty hung over the proceedings. The stakes had never been higher, both for Judge Emerson's legacy and the public's faith in the impartiality of the judicial system. The commission's final verdict would have far-reaching implications, not just for the judge herself, but for the very foundations of the law. The Commission on Judicial Conduct's investigation into Judge Sarah Emerson's conduct had been a painstaking and emotionally charged process, marked by harrowing testimony and damning evidence of potential racial bias. As the inquiry drew to a close, the commission members found themselves faced with an exceptionally complex and consequential decision. After weeks of deliberation, the panel finally reached its verdict, the gravity of their findings etched onto their faces as they prepared to deliver their ruling. All eyes turned to the commission's chair, a distinguished legal scholar with a reputation for impartiality and rigor. The Commission on Judicial Conduct has carefully reviewed the evidence presented during this investigation. The chair began, his voice steady but tinged with a note of solemnity. "While we did not find explicit or intentional racial discrimination in Judge Emerson's rulings, the cumulative data and testimony has revealed a deeply troubling pattern of implicit bias in her decision-making." A hush fell over the packed hearing room, the weight of the chair's words palpable. Alicia Jackson, seated in the front row, felt her heart racing as she waited with bated breath for the final verdict. The commission has determined that Judge Emerson's actions, while not explicitly discriminatory, have nevertheless resulted in a disproportionate and unjust impact on minority defendants in her court. The chair continued. This constitutes a violation of the Code of Judicial Conduct and undermines the foundational principles of fairness and equality that are essential to the proper administration of justice. Emerson, seated stoically at the defense table, felt a chill run down her spine. She had braced herself for the possibility of this outcome, but the finality of the Commission's ruling still stung. Her distinguished career, built on a lifetime of unwavering dedication to the law, now hung in the balance. As a result of these findings, the chair announced, "The Commission is recommending that Judge Emerson be suspended from the bench for a period of 6 months, without pay, and that she be required to undergo intensive training on implicit bias and cultural competency." The courtroom erupted in a flurry of activity, with reporters scrambling to capture the moment and civil rights advocates erupting into cheers. Alicia Jackson, her eyes brimming with tears, felt a sense of vindication wash over her. After months of anguish and uncertainty, justice had finally been served. But for Emerson, the Commission's verdict represented a devastating blow, both to her professional legacy and her deeply held sense of self. As she listened to the chair outline the disciplinary measures, the proud jurist felt a profound sense of shame and self-doubt. How could this have happened? Emerson asked herself, her hands trembling slightly. "I've dedicated my life to upholding the law and ensuring fairness in my courtroom. Where did I go wrong?" In the days and weeks that followed, Emerson found herself grappling with the fallout of the Commission's decision. Her suspension from the bench made national headlines, fueling further public scrutiny and debate over the role of implicit bias in the criminal justice system. For Alicia Jackson, the resolution of the case marked the beginning of a new chapter. With the help of community organizations and a growing network of supporters, she was able to pay off the crippling fine and begin to rebuild her life. But the scars of her experience would linger, a constant reminder of the systemic challenges faced by those on the margins of society. As Emerson faced the daunting task of reclaiming her reputation and regaining the public's trust, she knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous. The reckoning had come, and she would have to confront her own biases and shortcomings if she hoped to emerge from this ordeal as a better, more compassionate judge. The seismic reverberations of the Alicia Jackson case continued to be felt long after Judge Sarah Emerson's suspension from the bench. The explosive revelations of racial disparities in her courtroom had ignited a nationwide reckoning, sparking urgent calls for sweeping reforms to address the systemic inequities plaguing the criminal justice system. In the aftermath of the Commission on Judicial Conduct's ruling, Alicia's story became a rallying cry for civil rights advocates and community leaders across the country. Her face adorned the covers of magazines and newspapers, her name synonymous with the fight for true racial justice in the courts. Reverend Michael Owens, a prominent figure in the local protests, seized the moment to push for legislative changes that would hold judges accountable for their biases and sentencing practices. Working with a coalition of lawmakers, he spearheaded the introduction of a new bill that would mandate implicit bias training for all sitting judges, as well as the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review judicial conduct. Alicia Jackson's case exposed a systemic problem that goes far beyond one judge or one courtroom. Owens declared passionately during a press conference announcing the proposed legislation. "The disparities we've seen in sentencing, in bail decisions, in the overall treatment of defendants of color. It's a cancer that's been eating away at the foundations of our justice system for far too long." The bill quickly gained bipartisan support, with lawmakers from across the political spectrum recognizing the urgent need for reform. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and legal scholars offered their expertise, working alongside community organizers to craft a comprehensive set of measures aimed at addressing the deep-seated issues of bias and inequity. As the legislation navigated the complex legislative process, Alicia Jackson found herself thrust into the public spotlight once again. Embracing her newfound role as a symbol of the fight for change, she traveled the country, sharing her story and lending her voice to the growing movement. For too long, our justice system has been stacked against people like me, single mothers, people of color, those struggling to make ends meet, Alicia told a crowd of supporters at a rally in the state capitol. But no more. Today, we stand united, demanding that our elected leaders take real, meaningful action to ensure that the scales of justice are balanced for all. Alicia's impassioned pleas resonated with audiences nationwide, galvanizing a groundswell of public support that put immense pressure on lawmakers to act. As the bill inched closer to becoming law, Judge Emerson, now serving out the remainder of her suspension, watched the events unfold with a mix of trepidation and reluctant admiration. In the privacy of her home, Emerson grappled with the profound impact of the case, both on her own legacy and on the broader system she had dedicated her career to serving. The months of intensive training, self-reflection, and introspection had been a humbling and transformative experience, forcing her to confront the biases and blind spots she had long denied. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Emerson murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the lines of an old photograph that captured her early days on the bench. "I was just trying to do my job, to uphold the law to the best of my abilities. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what true justice really means." As the legislative session drew to a close, the landmark bill was finally signed into law, ushering in a new era of accountability and reform in the state's judicial system. Alicia Jackson, surrounded by a chorus of cheering supporters, wiped away tears of joy, knowing that her story had become a catalyst for lasting change. For Judge Emerson, the path to redemption would be a long and arduous one. But as she contemplated the future, she found herself filled with a renewed sense of purpose and a determination to become a better, more compassionate arbiter of justice, one whose rulings would always be guided by the principles of fairness, equity, and the unwavering pursuit of true equality under the law.